Hi everyone, my name is Ara, I'm from the SheSharp team. Welcome to our summer webinar edition where we'll be exploring JavaScript for beginners. If this is your first time hearing about SheSharp, let me tell you first a little bit more about what we do and who we are. So, SheSharp is a nonprofit foundation based in Amsterdam. We foster diversity and inclusion in technology and entrepreneurship by providing an open and safe community to underrepresented demographics to explore their interest and potential. If you want to know more about our upcoming events or activities, you can check out our website or one of our social media channels, but I strongly recommend you to join our Slack channel. You will be able to get in touch with our SheSharp team as well as with our community. We are always on the lookout for interesting speakers and topics, so if you'd like to talk at our event, just submit your proposal through the link here. Also, if you are a company who would like to host a SheSharp event, you can let us know through the link you can see here. Now, today's webinar has been prepared in collaboration with Offersen. Who is Offersen? Offersen is the developer job platform that has your back, complete with your own dev career coach and upfront informations about salary. For more information about Offersen, you can always check out their website www.offersen.com. Now, I'm super happy that Offersen is giving away their swag for this webinar. So if you want it, just scan the QR code you can see here on the screen or use the link here. Now, let's get back to our webinar. So, let me introduce you our speaker, Naledi, mostly backend junior developer from South Africa. Naledi will be sharing her own story of learning JavaScript. She will also showcase some examples, some practical examples using JavaScript language. And she will also share some fun times, but also obstacles she came across along the way. Now, let's start.
Hi, my name is Naledi Matutoane and I'm a junior, mainly backend developer from South Africa. Today, I'll be talking about my experience learning and working with JavaScript as a junior. I'll cover pain points, personal gripes, as well as the fun I've had using the language and some of the interesting things I've learned away and the way the language has forced me to evolve as a developer. I first started working in JavaScript back in college in 2017. I went to a non-traditional tertiary institution where all my knowledge came from practical projects as well as learning from my peers. In the second semester of my first year, only after 5 months of coding, all of which were previously in C, we started on the basics of web development. My first project was to develop a website similar in functionality to that of Tinder and other such dating sites. A peer and I took on the bold task of learning Vue.js to accomplish this task, and needless to say, looking back on the project and the codebase today, you could tell we'd never worked in JavaScript before. Thereafter, I created 2 projects in Angular, also a disaster. And today, I work as a full-stack developer using JavaScript in my everyday work for projects based on Google APIs and React.js. I've continued my journey in development using JavaScript mainly because there is a continued need for JavaScript developers around the world, as web applications are highly in demand on a daily basis, and it doesn't seem like that is slowing down anytime soon. There are, of course, many other languages you can use to create web apps, such as Ruby, PHP, Python, SheSharp, and many others. However, support for them all is not necessarily as readily available as with JavaScript. Alongside that, people are continuously developing open source and community projects to leverage the power of JavaScript for creative website development, such as these. Fingerspelling is an interactive website that uses the power of JavaScript animations and AI to help teach users American Sign Language. And lastly, Elon's Toilet, an awesome animation stack page that brings to the user's attention the risks of colon cancer.
1, 0.
Is there life on Mars?
I'm sure you've heard the story of how JavaScript was created in 10 days. If you haven't, don't worry. I also only learned about it while doing research and talking topics for this presentation. The story goes something like this. Originally called Mocha, as a nod to its lingual influence from Java, and then LiveScript, and then JavaScript to gain traction off of the hype that Java was getting at the time, JavaScript was designed as an extension of Java, which at the time was way too hefty of a language to manage the quick tasks that JavaScript was designed to do, such as filling in online forms, which was usually a long procedure considering the information had to be validated server-side. Alongside JavaScript, Microsoft released its competitor into the web browser market called JScript, which was the backbone of Internet Explorer 3. The release of these two languages, with varying levels of similarity and absolutely no standardization between the two, started the issue which we see today, browser incompatibility. Which brings us to ECMA script, the only thing keeping me and my colleagues from falling out with each other on a daily basis. ECMA, or the European Computer Manufacturers Association, are a committee that help define syntactic and semantic standards for languages, and in our specific case, JavaScript. Through trial and error, they birthed what we know today as ECMA script, which, funny enough, is not the same as JavaScript. ECMA script is a general-purpose scripting language used by browsers to interpret JavaScript. Implementing ECMA script in JavaScript has three distinct parts. These are JavaScript's core, which is based on ECMA script, the standardization of the language that we know today, such as syntax, data types, objects, statements, etc. Part 2 is the document object model, or DOM, basically what the browser renders for client-side viewing. And lastly, we have the browser object model, or BOM. The BOM allows developers to manipulate the browser window and is recognizable as the window object in JavaScript. I absolutely loved JavaScript when I first learned it. It was simple, its syntax kind of made sense, and it was easy for me to use, having absolutely no compatibility issues between Unix and Windows-based command line interfaces, since it was run on the web. I mentioned initially that I started my development lifetime in C. Looking at the differences between C and JavaScript, the two are vastly different when it comes to syntax. Let's look at a simple hello world program that prints to our standard output, for example. So the first thing I need to do in C is to include my standard lib.h. So I'm going to do that real quick. A few typing errors along the way, apparently. You can see I haven't done this in a while. And basically, without this wonderful library, I would need to take quite a few more steps to print anything out to our standard output. After that, I'm going to declare my main function. I also need to declare a return type for my function, and since it's our main function, like our main program function, I'm going to be returning an int. So we'll call that main. Now I need to declare its input parameters within this bracket over here. However, because I won't be taking in any input from the standard input, I can leave it blank for now. Now we'll do the classic opening brackets with the matching clothing brace, and that's our function declaration pretty much done. Now, let's do the same thing in JavaScript. We've got a JavaScript file here. The first difference we're going to see is that our JavaScript is not going to be run on a traditional command line, like a language like C, or on a traditional like computer terminal, but rather in browser. Therefore, our standard output will be the web browser console, which you can see over here in Chrome. I've opened it using the F12 key, and if I use my console.log function, we'll type in hello world, it prints out to the console's standard output. Traditionally, the console is used only for testing, and since we're not designing an entire web page just yet, we'll be using it. Now, the second difference is that thanks to ECMA script, in browser, we will not need to include any libraries, as ECMA script has its own functions that we will use here and which will be implemented through JavaScript. Firstly, we're going to declare a function. So all we need to do to declare a function in JavaScript is type the function keyword. It is a reserved word in JavaScript, so you can't use it for variable names, or yeah, that's mainly like your limitation. You can't use it for variable names, class names, object names, that kind of thing. And then we'll add our input parameters just like in C. So we'll put our function name, leave a bracket for our input parameters, just like in C. And you'll notice main difference here is that we don't declare a function return type. And where we were going to use input parameters, these would not, their return types or the variable types would also not need to be declared. But we'll go into that a little later. This is quite a big appeal for a lot of people when using JavaScript. JavaScript is known as a weakly or untyped language, which means that variables, objects, and functions do not need to be typed or even typecasted. I'll drop a link near the end where you can go get more examples, and you can get more explanations on typed, untyped, and weakly typed languages. Cool. Now we'll add our curly braces again as usual, and that's our function declaration in JavaScript also done. Now we're going to go back to C, and let's give the function its functionality. We're going to be using the printf function to print our standard output, and its parameters are simply the string we'll be outputting. So I'm going to declare printf, and I'm going to put in here, hello world. Most people generally put a little comma over there, followed by my semicolon. And you'll see here we use double quotes to declare a string in C. If you use single quotes, C will automatically assume what's between the single quotes is a single character. So in C, you use single quotes for a character and double quotes for a string or a series of characters. Note the semicolon at the end of the line. Without this, the compiler would return errors and we wouldn't be able to compile this program. After that, after this printf, we're now going to define our return value, which is going to be a simple 0, which stands for a successful function execution, and this is our program done. My IntelliSense is not shouting at me, so there's no errors in the C program. Now if we go back to JavaScript, instead of using printf, we'll be using the console.log function. And it's pretty much, the parameters are pretty much the same. So we'll type console.log, stop log, and we're going to put in our hello world, and that's that. We don't need a return variable, as our function does not need to return anything. And now comes something that I am not particularly fond of in JavaScript, but we're going to talk about the semicolon that I've put at the end here. And semicolons in JavaScript are optional. What does that mean? Well, JavaScript has something called automatic semicolon insertion, or ASI. The main idea behind automatic semicolon insertion is that what happens in the background when a JavaScript passes your code is there's an automatic program running in the background. And what it does is it inserts semicolons where it's necessary when you run your code. Because in JavaScript, there are situations where semicolons are required, otherwise your code could break. The job of automatic semicolon insertion is to make sure your code follows these rules, and if some required semicolon is missing, ASI will add it. So I now have my function.js, my main.js file, and what I need to do in order to execute it within the browser is I need to embed it within an HTML file. I have this main HTML file here. I'm going to open my HTML tag, I'm going to create the head, and within the head tag, I will insert a script tag, and what I'm going to tell it is I'm going to tell it where to reference a JavaScript file. And the JavaScript file we want to reference is our function main.js. So I'm going to say defer source, which means this is where I want you to look for the file. And because they're in the same fault directory on my computer, I just need a reference function main.js, and I can then close the tag. In order to get my HTML working, I now need to physically call my main function in JavaScript. All I need to do that is call main. And what happens is when the program runs through, it'll get to the end here, it'll see, ooh, okay, I'm calling this function main, which is up here, and it's going to execute the contents of the function. Save this. And now we'll go back to browser. You can see in Chrome here, I have my main.html open, it's referencing from my desktop. I have my JavaScript file in the same folder, in the same directory. When I reload this page, we're going to get hello world here in the console, which means our main function works. Returning to our main function.js, I want to show you another weird behavior of JavaScript. You might see this often with people who have a lot of experience with JavaScript. But JavaScript has the ability to let you use functions even before you've declared them. If I were to do this in C, let's use another function called increment. Let's call this function called increment. And I'll declare it down here. Void increment. No variables. All we're going to have is an integer, equate to 0, and we'll increment it just once. That is all. Now, were I to have a proper C compiler here, it would shout at me and tell me that it doesn't know what this function is. I haven't declared it prior, and I'm already using it in my main function. C wouldn't like that, and the entire program would break during compiling. However, if I go in JavaScript and I do the exact same thing, I am executing it, I am calling it. However, I've only declared it underneath. Were I to go back, our web browser, here we go. If I reload the page, we still get our hello world without a problem. This kind of behavior is called hoisting, and it is what happens when you invoke or call a function before it has been defined. This happens in JavaScript because functions are essentially saved for later use in memory, where JavaScript knows that they may need to be called upon later. Now, so we can just see an example of JavaScript and a full function in practice. Let's create a simple program that uses quite a few variables. Let's create a simple calculator program. Let's declare our calculator function. We will take in a first number, an operation, and a second number. Let's add our return value for this calculator. We are going to return a value called result. We will declare it using var result. There are different types of variables in JavaScript. You also get const variables. And what these are variables whose values do not change. We also get let variables. And this is generally the best practice instead of using var. And what let variables are variables whose values can change. We will simply use var, which is perfectly allowed. And let's create our logic. So we will say if our operator is equal to a plus sign, then we will say number 1 plus number 2, and we will make result equal to the sum of those two numbers. Next, we can say else if operator is equal to a minus sign, then we will have our result equal to number 1 minus number 2. Next, we'll say if our operator is equal to a asterisk, our result will be number 1 times number 2. And lastly, if our operator is equal to a forward slash, our result will be equal to number 1 divided by number, oh my goodness. Perfect. We can now return that result, but instead of returning it, let us console log it so that we can see what our result is. And now we will call calculator a few times. We will do calculator 1, pass through the number 1, and we will times it by 5. Next, we will do the number 5 subtracted by number 4. Next, we will do the number 8 multiplied by the number 3. And lastly, let's use our division. We will use the number 9, divided by the number 3. Let's save that. I still have the same function, the same file referenced in my HTML file. We can now go to Chrome. I will refresh the page and you will see we will get a different result in our console. We named a variable incorrectly. So you can see I'm only getting my error as soon as I'm in Chrome here and as soon as the program's been executed. So now I will go back to our code. You can see here the issues that I called my variable here operation, but I was referencing it as operator here. So I will simply change it up here to be called operator. I will save the file again. And now back in Chrome, let us refresh the page and we get our results. So our first one is 5, and our operation for that was 1 times 5. We get the number 1 for our second operation, which is 5 minus 4. We get 24 for the next one, which is 8 times 3. And we get the number 3 for our 9 divided by 3. And our function works. Now, as a last example of some behaviors that make JavaScript easier to use, I want to show you what happens if I remove these semicolons. You can see there I've removed them. Any language like C or Java would generally not appreciate this kind of behavior. But if we are to go back into Chrome and I reload the page, you can see we still get our hello world printed out thanks to automatic semicolon insertion. These are some of my personal pros and cons of JavaScript that I've experienced and think about on a daily basis. I found that JavaScript is an extremely easy language to learn. It doesn't have a sharp learning curve, and I witnessed this firsthand when we got a group of interns at work that had never used JavaScript before, but they still managed to create us a fully functional React application within 2 months. JavaScript's functionality is nigh on limitless. Whether you want to create a simple calculator or an intricate web page, dozens of animations and backend functionality, I almost guarantee you can get it done with JavaScript. Alongside that, JavaScript is extremely popular in the job market. I think we can attribute this case due to the fact that we live in a web-based society, and JavaScript is so widely supported and used in this case. Saying that, I think that JavaScript is also an almost necessary skill to have today, should you want to get into some kind of web or application-based development. And lastly, JavaScript has no operating system related compatibility issues, as you see with some other languages, which may need different compilers or libraries depending on which system the user is on, meaning Unix versus Windows-based systems. I can't sing JavaScript's praises without adding a few of my own personal gripes. I feel that JavaScript has too much freedom with regards to syntax. There are some very basic rules that other languages follow that JavaScript does not. This leads to issues regarding the fact that everyone has a different coding style. However, with such minimal rules and practices in place, JavaScript makes coding with peers a very challenging task. Because JavaScript is an untyped language, running into related issues can occur more often than you'd like, especially with larger programs. And lastly, the lack of debugging facilities means you can run into some very weird errors, which take slightly longer to solve than others, and which can only be picked up during program execution. I do believe that JavaScript is the perfect language for beginners. Its ease of use and lack of finickiness means that you need the bare minimum to start learning it, and even becoming good at it. Unlike other low-level languages like C and C++, and more like modern languages, JavaScript does not face compatibility issues when moving between operating systems and architectures. where most older languages require the system that they are being run on to have certain libraries and modules installed, JavaScript comes pre-packaged in browser with everything that you require to execute a program without any hiccups. Another nifty trick that can aid in JavaScript development are plugins of code editors. Editors such as VS Code, which is free, contain community-developed plugins that make the development of JavaScript specifically a breeze. My favorite such plugin is IntelliSense, a very smart plugin that is able to suggest and even autocomplete functions and references to JavaScript objects and functions, which is a great help when learning about the nuances of JavaScript. I mentioned earlier that I believe JavaScript has a very slight growth curve. This is where I started back in 2017. I created this project with a teammate and it took us about 4 months to complete. Imagine! Nowadays, I've created a few websites for myself in my spare time that I use React for. They're recreational sites that I use to showcase my hobbies, etc. And I think I'm definitely getting better each time. This is what I do at work. I can't share the intricate details, but this is an example of some of the stuff I do all on my own occasionally. It looks way more simple than it actually is, but creating something like this usually takes up to a week for an MVP, and there's always a lot of testing and changes that go in afterwards. And that pretty much concludes what I have to say for today. I hope that you are no longer daunted by what JavaScript has to offer, but rather excited and perhaps inspired to go forth and create some of your own beautiful sites. Rome wasn't built in a day, and I promise neither were many of the websites you see around today. I will attach below a bunch of links and resources that I found useful during my JavaScript time, and I thank you for watching. Bye!